Imagine you are standing in the middle of a dense, ancient forest. You are hundreds of miles away from the nearest paved road, and the closest cell phone tower is nothing more than a distant memory. At first, you think the absolute silence surrounding you is peaceful. You close your eyes, take a deep breath, and try to relax. But then a cold, sharp chill crawls slowly up your spine as your brain begins to process the horrifying truth. This is not peace. The birds are not singing. The insects have stopped chirping. The wind itself seems to have died. The forest is completely quiet because every single living thing around you is holding its breath in absolute terror of something standing just out of sight. A lot of people hear stories about the deep, dark woods, and they immediately think of campfire legends. They think of Bigfoot, or ghosts, or some supernatural monster wandering aimlessly through the trees at midnight. But I am here to tell you that the most terrifying things in the wilderness do not have glowing red eyes or matted fur. The most terrifying things are completely undeniably human. What happens when the utter isolation of the deep woods shatters a person's mind, turning them into something entirely unrecognizable? Today's story is a chilling exact example of that dark, disturbing reality. This is the story of the Blackwood Valley mystery, but before we get into that, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you have come to the right place, because that is all we do, and we upload once or twice every single week. So, if that is of interest to you, please invite the like button on a relaxing weekend camping trip. Wait until it falls into a deep sleep inside its cozy little tent, and then secretly steal all of its shoes and sprint all the way back to the city. Also, please subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let us get into today's story. Our story begins in the early autumn of the year 2015. The leaves in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States were just starting to turn brilliant, fiery shades of orange and red, bringing a crisp, biting chill to the early morning air. Our main character for today is a man named Arthur Pendleton. Now, Arthur was not just your average weekend hiker who bought a shiny new pair of boots online and decided to brave the local, well-paved nature trail. Arthur was a heavily trained former park ranger. He had spent 15 solid years of his life working in some of the most rugged, unforgiving, and dangerous terrain in all of North America. During his career, he had survived a minor avalanche, he had safely defused a face-to-face encounter with a massive grizzly bear, and he had personally led dozens of search and rescue missions to find lost hikers. He knew exactly how to track wildlife, he knew how to navigate flawlessly by looking at the stars, and he knew exactly what to do if things went catastrophically wrong out in the wild. Because of his incredibly extensive background, Arthur was completely comfortable being alone in the wilderness. In fact, he genuinely preferred it. After officially retiring from the Forest Service, he made it a strict personal tradition to take a 3-day solo camping trip deep into the uncharted backcountry every single October. It was his unique way of resetting his mind, getting away from the loud, exhausting noise of the city, and just breathing in the raw, unfiltered mountain air. On a very chilly Thursday morning, Arthur stood in his driveway and loaded up his heavy-duty, military-grade hiking backpack. He packed enough freeze-dried food for 5 days just to be on the safe side. He carefully packed his high-end water filtration system, a durable all-weather tent, a reliable razor-sharp hunting knife, his favorite thermal sleeping bag, and his trusty brass compass. Interestingly, he did not bring a firearm. Arthur always firmly believed that if you respected the woods and understood your environment, the woods would respect you back. He threw his pack into the bed of his old battered pickup truck and drove about 4 hours directly north of his home. He drove past the sprawling city limits, past the quiet suburban neighborhoods, and finally turned off the main concrete highway onto an incredibly old, overgrown, and completely forgotten logging road. He drove another painstakingly slow 20 miles down this bumpy, heavily rutted dirt path until the road simply ended abruptly at a massive wall of towering, ancient pine trees. This was the absolute edge of the Blackwood Valley region. It was a massive, sprawling expanse of untamed, wild territory that was notoriously difficult to navigate. There were absolutely no official trails out here. There were no ranger stations. There were no emergency call boxes. Once you stepped past the tree line and into the shadows, you were entirely on your own. Arthur parked his truck, locked the doors securely, and hoisted his heavy pack onto his strong shoulders. He took a long, deep breath of the sharp, pine-scented air, feeling a familiar rush of pure excitement wash over him. The local weather forecast had confidently predicted clear skies and cool, manageable temperatures for the next 3 days. It was supposed to be the absolute perfect trip. He checked his brass compass, took a bearing heading dead north, and stepped confidently into the dense, waist-high brush. For the first few hours of his hike, everything was absolutely picture perfect. The warm afternoon sunlight filtered beautifully through the thick green canopy above, casting long golden beams of light across the forest floor. The sound of his heavy leather boots crunching rhythmically against the dry, dead autumn leaves was deeply soothing. He spotted a few white-tailed deer grazing peacefully in the distance, and he even paused for several minutes to quietly watch a massive red-tailed hawk circle lazily in the bright, cloudless blue sky above. By the time early afternoon rolled around, Arthur had successfully hiked roughly 8 miles deep into the isolated valley. He was feeling fantastic. His legs felt remarkably strong, his breathing was slow and steady, and his mind was completely clear of all the built-up stress from his daily life back in civilization. But as the sun slowly began to dip lower into the afternoon sky, casting long, strange, and eerie shadows across the uneven ground, the overall atmosphere in the deep woods began to subtly shift. It was a very minor change at first. It was nothing you could easily point a finger at or logically explain. But as someone who had spent more than half of his entire life surviving in the wild, Arthur felt it immediately in the pit of his stomach. The gentle breeze that had been blowing all morning died down completely. The air grew unnervingly heavy and thick, and as he stopped walking to take a long drink of water from his metal canteen, he suddenly realized that even though he knew for a fact he was totally alone, he felt profoundly, deeply exposed. It felt exactly like there was a heavy pair of eyes staring a hole straight through the back of his neck. Now, when you spend as much time completely alone in the remote wilderness as Arthur had, you learn very quickly that your mind can and will play tricks on you. The human brain absolutely hates a vacuum. When you are totally isolated from the constant, comforting stimulation of modern society, your imagination tends to overwork itself. Arthur knew this fact perfectly well. He took a deep breath, firmly adjusted the heavy straps of his backpack, and rationally told himself that he was just experiencing a brief moment of isolation paranoia. He was a highly trained professional. He had survived blizzards, he had tracked lost children through treacherous canyons, and he certainly was not going to let a sudden bout of the creeps ruin his annual vacation. He took a sip of water, put his canteen away, and forced himself to keep walking deeper into the uncharted heart of the Blackwood Valley. But as he pushed forward, the physical landscape around him began to change in ways that he simply could not ignore. The terrain shifted from a reasonably pleasant, rolling forest floor to a grueling, incredibly demanding obstacle course. The ancient towering trees grew impossibly thick, their massive trunks practically growing right on top of one another. The dense green canopy far above him turned into a tightly woven, impenetrable web of thick branches and dark pine needles, aggressively blocking out almost all of the remaining afternoon sun. It literally felt as if Arthur had walked out of the middle of the day and stepped directly into the gloomy, dim light of late twilight. Then the temperature began to plummet. It did not just get a little bit chilly as the afternoon wore on. It dropped incredibly fast in a way that felt entirely unnatural. Within the span of maybe 20 minutes, the surrounding air went from a comfortable 65 degrees down to what felt like freezing. Arthur actually had to take off his heavy backpack and dig out a thick, insulated flannel jacket. As he quickly zipped up his jacket, shivering slightly, he realized something else was deeply wrong. The actual smell of the air had completely changed. Just an hour earlier, the forest had smelled exactly like you would expect, like crisp pine, fresh mountain air, and rich dirt. But now the air smelled incredibly heavy, sour, and distinctly metallic. It smelled exactly like old, rusted copper pennies left out in the rain, mixed faintly with the undeniable, sickening scent of something rotting just out of his line of sight. He secured his backpack and started walking again, but his pace slowed down drastically. He was hyper-aware of his surroundings. Now his eyes darted nervously from tree to tree, searching the deep shadows. And that is exactly when the silence truly hit him. Now, when most people think of a quiet, peaceful forest, they still imagine ambient background noise. They imagine the gentle rustling of dry leaves, the distant snap of a dry twig, the faint hum of insects, or the singing of birds. But what Arthur was experiencing right now was not quiet. It was a complete and total sensory vacuum. The birds that had been chirping happily all morning were completely gone. The crickets were dead silent. Even the wind had completely died, leaving the branches above perfectly. It was so impossibly, deeply quiet that the only sound Arthur could hear was the frantic, heavy thumping of his own heart beating against his ribs and the loud, rushing sound of his own blood pumping violently through his ears. It was the exact kind of suffocating silence that instinctively tells the primitive animal part of your human brain that a massive, dangerous apex predator is standing directly behind you. Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly, carefully turned his head, scanning the thick wall of trees and heavy shadows surrounding him. Nothing moved. There was absolutely nothing there. He instinctively reached down and gripped the sturdy wooden handle of the hunting knife attached securely to his belt, just to reassure himself it was still there. He tried once again to mentally shake off the intense creeping dread. He told himself out loud, speaking into the empty air, that he was just being stupid. Hearing his own voice echoing weakly in the dead, quiet woods did not make him feel much better, but it gave him just enough courage to keep moving forward. He hiked for another 2 exhausting miles, desperately trying to find a suitable flat clearing to set up his camp for the night. The sun was getting incredibly low now, and he knew exactly how dangerous it was to try and navigate off trail in pitch black darkness. Finally, he pushed his way through a thick, tangled patch of thorny bushes and stepped out into a small, naturally formed circular clearing. It was relatively flat, mostly covered in dry packed dirt and dead brown leaves. Under any normal circumstances, it would look like the absolute perfect spot to pitch a tent. But as Arthur stepped away from the bushes and into the center of the clearing, he froze completely solid. Sitting dead in the exact mathematical center of this isolated, untamed clearing, completely miles and miles away from any known human settlement or mapped hiking trail, was a pile of rocks. But it was not just a random pile of rocks that had tumbled down a hillside. It was a meticulously man-made rock cairn. A cairn is a carefully balanced stack of stones, usually left by hikers to mark a confusing trail intersection. But there was absolutely no trail out here. Furthermore, this specific stack of rocks was completely, deeply wrong. It stood exactly 3 feet tall. It consisted of exactly 7 smooth, perfectly round, pale gray river stones, each one slightly smaller than the stone placed below it. They were balanced so flawlessly, so incredibly perfectly, that they looked like they were defying the laws of gravity. But here is the problem. As an expert in this specific region, Arthur knew for an absolute fact that the closest river capable of smoothing stones like that was at least 5 miles away across brutal terrain. Someone or something had deliberately carried 7 incredibly heavy, perfectly smooth river stones deep into the middle of the absolute nowhere, just to perfectly stack them in the exact spot Arthur was planning to sleep. Arthur stood there for what felt like an eternity, his eyes locked onto those 7 perfectly balanced stones. His mind scrambled, desperately trying to find a logical, rational explanation for why this incredibly unnatural structure was sitting in the middle of a completely untamed wilderness. He finally convinced himself of the only scenario that made any sense. Another extreme off-grid hiker must have passed through this exact clearing weeks, or maybe even months ago, and built the cairn as a personal milestone. It was highly unlikely, yes, but it was physically possible. Arthur forced himself to accept this theory because the alternative was simply too terrifying to think about. He checked his watch. It was nearing 7 o'clock in the evening, and the last dying rays of the sun were rapidly fading behind the thick tree line. It was too late to turn back and too dark to safely push forward to find a new spot. He had to make camp right here, right next to the rocks. He immediately went into his familiar, comforting survival routine. He dropped his heavy backpack, quickly unpacked his all-weather tent, and set it up on the flattest patch of dirt he could find, intentionally placing it a good 20 feet away from the strange stone structure. He then spent the next 45 minutes frantically gathering as much dry deadwood as he could find before the pitch-black darkness fully set in. Building a campfire is often the greatest psychological comfort a person can have in the deep woods. The moment Arthur struck a match and got a small crackling fire going, the entire atmosphere of the clearing seemed to shift back to normal. The bright, dancing orange flames pushed away the oppressive, heavy shadows, and the familiar smell of burning pine wood easily overpowered that sickening, metallic scent of rusted pennies that had been hanging in the air earlier. Arthur sat on a large log near the fire, boiled some water using his portable camping stove, and ate a hot, freeze-dried meal of beef stew. As the warmth of the food filled his stomach and the heat of the fire warmed his freezing hands, he actually laughed out loud at himself. The sound of his own laughter echoed lightly through the trees. He felt foolish. He was a professional, a grown man with 15 years of hardcore wilderness experience, and he had let a sudden temperature drop and a pile of rocks spook him like a child watching a scary movie. By 9 o'clock that night, Arthur felt completely relaxed and in control again. He double-checked the perimeter of his camp, securely hung his heavy-duty, 50-foot nylon rope over a thick tree branch a few yards away to dry out some damp clothing, and crawled inside his tent. He zipped the flap tightly shut, slipped into his thermal sleeping bag, and within 10 minutes, he was dead asleep. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, Arthur's eyes snapped wide open. He did not wake up slowly, groggily rubbing his eyes. He woke up instantly, his entire body going completely rigid, his heart already hammering frantically against his ribs. The primitive survival instinct buried deep inside, his brain had tripped a massive alarm, pulling him from a deep sleep into total hyper-aware panic. It was pitch black inside the tent. The fire outside had died hours ago. He held his breath, straining his ears to listen to the darkness. For almost a full minute, there was nothing but that same suffocating dead silence. And then he heard it. It was faint, but it was unmistakable. Step pause, step pause. Arthur felt all the blood drain rapidly from his face. He knew the sounds of the forest better than anyone. If a bear wanders into your camp, you hear heavy, clumsy thuds and loud sniffing. If a raccoon or a coyote comes looking for food, you hear rapid, light scurrying. But the sound echoing outside his thin nylon tent right now was none of those things. The footsteps were slow, heavily calculated, and entirely bipedal. Something walking on two legs was carefully shifting its weight, intentionally trying to make as little noise as possible while crushing the dry, dead autumn leaves under its feet. Arthur slowly, silently slid his right hand out of his sleeping bag and gripped the cold, hard handle of his hunting knife. He lay frozen on his back, staring up into the absolute darkness of the tent ceiling. The slow, methodical footsteps continued to circle his tent. The invisible intruder walked all the way around the perimeter, stopping for agonizingly long periods of time at different angles, as if it was studying the structure. Then the footsteps stopped completely. Arthur waited, his lungs burning from holding his breath. Suddenly, he heard a soft, horrifyingly gentle brushing sound. Whatever was out there was slowly dragging something rough against the outside fabric of the tent. It sounded exactly like the dirty, calloused fingertips of a human hand, slowly tracing the seam of the nylon wall, pressing just hard enough to make the fabric bow inward. The brushing moved slowly from the bottom of the tent, sliding upwards right past the spot where Arthur's head was resting. He was mere inches away from the intruder, separated by nothing but a millimeter of thin fabric. Arthur gripped his knife so hard, his knuckles turned totally white, silently praying that the zipper of the tent would not start to open. The presence lingered right beside his head for what felt like 3 or 4 minutes. Then silently, the pressure released. The slow, calculated footsteps started up again, gradually fading away into the deep woods until the suffocating silence returned. Arthur did not sleep for a single second for the rest of the night. He lay perfectly still, knife drawn, staring into the blackness, until the very first gray light of dawn finally began to bleed through the tent walls around 6 o'clock in the morning. When he was absolutely certain the sun was up, he unzipped the tent and stepped outside, his muscles screaming from being tensed up for hours. The clearing looked exactly the same as it had the night before. The fire pit was nothing but cold, gray ashes. The 7 smooth stones were still stacked perfectly in the center. Arthur immediately dropped to his knees and meticulously inspected the dirt around his tent. What he found made his stomach turn completely over. The ground was heavily disturbed. The leaves crushed exactly where he had heard the footsteps, but there were absolutely no clear shoe prints. Whatever had been walking around his tent had wrapped its feet in something soft, like heavy animal hides or thick cloth, specifically to mask its tracks. Arthur stood up, his mind racing. He told himself he was packing up and leaving right now. But as he turned to grab his belongings, his eyes fell upon the thick oak tree where he had hung his gear the night before. The damp clothing he had laid out was thrown carelessly onto the muddy ground. But his heavy-duty, 50-foot nylon climbing rope was completely gone. In its exact place, deliberately tied to the same exact branch, using a thin, freshly cut green vine, was a thick, dead pine branch. It had been snapped perfectly in half and placed there neatly like some kind of sick, twisted trade. The intruder had not just watched him sleep, it had stolen from him and left a physical message behind to guarantee that Arthur knew exactly what had happened. Arthur did not waste a single second trying to analyze the deeply twisted psychology behind the stolen rope and the broken branch. The moment he registered what had happened, his pure, unfiltered survival instincts took complete control. He did not bother carefully folding his expensive all-weather tent or organizing his cooking gear. He frantically shoved everything into his heavy-duty backpack in less than 10 minutes, his hands shaking slightly with a mixture of raw adrenaline and mounting terror. His #1 priority was to get out of the Blackwood Valley as fast as physically possible and get back to the safety of his locked pickup truck. He strapped his heavy pack onto his back, drew his hunting knife from its leather sheath and held it firmly in his right hand. With his left hand, he reached into his front chest pocket and pulled out his heavy brass compass. He flipped the metal lid open, expecting to quickly find south so he could retrace his steps directly out of the dense forest. But as he looked down at the glass dial, his heart dropped straight into his stomach. The tiny magnetized needle inside the compass was not pointing north. It was not pointing anywhere. The needle was spinning around and around in slow, continuous circles. Then it would violently jerk to the left, vibrate aggressively for a few seconds, and start spinning backwards. Arthur slapped the compass hard against the palm of his hand, thinking the gears were just temporarily stuck. He held it flat again. The needle twitched, spun around twice, and then pointed dead west, before floating lazily toward the east. The magnetic field in this specific part of the deep woods was completely warped, rendering his most vital navigation tool absolutely useless. Arthur swallowed hard, feeling a thick lump form in the back of his dry throat. Without a working compass, he was flying blind in an unmapped, endlessly repeating sea of towering pine trees. However, he was a 15-year veteran of the Forest Service. He knew how to navigate by looking at the sun and reading the natural moss growth on the sides of the tree trunks. Since it was early morning, the sun would be rising in the east. If he kept the morning sun hitting the left side of his face, he should theoretically be walking directly south, right back toward the old logging road. It was a risky, imprecise method, but it was the only option he had left. He took a deep, shaky breath, locked his eyes onto the thick tree line ahead of him, and started marching. He set a brutal, punishing pace, practically jogging through the thick underbrush. He ignored the painful scratches from thorny bushes, tearing at his pants, and the heavy, burning sensation in his leg muscles. He just needed to put as much distance between himself and that clearing as possible. For the first 2 hours, he made incredibly good time. The forest was still completely devoid of any normal animal sounds, but he felt like he was finally making real progress. But right around the 3-hour mark, things took a terrifying turn. Arthur paused to catch his breath and wipe the thick sweat from his forehead. As he leaned his shoulder against a massive ancient oak tree, he noticed something strange carved into the rough bark right at his eye level. At first glance, he thought it was just an old logging mark. But as he looked closer, he realized it was a freshly carved symbol. It looked like a deeply jagged, distorted triangle with 2 aggressive diagonal lines slashing straight through the center. It was not a recognizable letter or a standard trailblaze. It looked violent and chaotic. Arthur reached out and gently touched the deep gouges in the wood. His index finger came away incredibly sticky. The amber-colored tree sap inside the carving was still completely wet and oozing slowly down the bark. This mark had not been made years ago, or even days ago. Judging by the freshness of the wet sap, this violent symbol had been violently carved into the tree with a very sharp blade less than an hour ago. A cold sweat broke out all over Arthur's body. He immediately backed away from the tree, gripping his knife tighter. He turned his body slightly to the right and started walking again, intentionally trying to veer away from whatever path the carver was marking. He walked for another 20 minutes, his eyes frantically scanning the surrounding trees. Then he saw it again. Another identical, jagged triangle slashed into a pine tree. The sap was still dripping. 10 minutes later, he found a third symbol, then a fourth. They were perfectly spaced out, as if whoever was out there was deliberately leaving breadcrumbs for him to find. Panic, real and suffocating, finally began to claw its way into Arthur's disciplined mind. He realized with absolute horrifying certainty that these marks were not meant for the intruder to find their own way around. They were meant for Arthur. They were specifically designed to steer him in a certain direction. He stubbornly refused to play the game. He made a sharp 90-degree turn to his left, completely abandoning his southern trajectory, and marched straight into the thickest, most difficult patch of overgrown briars he could find, determined to break out of this invisible corridor. He hiked relentlessly for another 2 straight hours. He pushed himself to the absolute limits of his physical endurance, scrambling up steep, muddy ravines and pushing through impossibly dense thickets. His lungs burned, his water supply was getting dangerously low, and his heavy legs felt like they were made of solid lead. Eventually, the thick brush began to clear, and he stumbled out into a relatively open, flat section of the woods. He bent over, resting his hands on his knees, gasping violently for air. As he slowly stood up straight to get his bearings, his eyes locked onto a massive, ancient oak tree standing about 20 yards directly in front of him. He recognized the strange, twisted shape of the thick roots practically bursting out of the dirt at the base of the tree. He slowly walked toward it, his legs suddenly feeling very weak and numb. As he stepped up to the massive trunk, he looked right at eye level. There, staring right back at him, was the very first jagged, distorted triangle he had touched over 2 hours ago. The sticky sap had slightly dried, but it was the exact same carving. Arthur felt the world spin dizzily around him. Despite walking in what he firmly believed was a completely straight line for over 2 hours, using the sun to guide his way, he had somehow walked in a massive, perfect circle. He was trapped in a completely disorienting maze, and someone or something was effortlessly herding him like a blind, helpless animal right back into the center of the trap. Arthur stood completely frozen in front of that marked oak tree, staring at the dripping sap as if it were bleeding. The psychological blow of realizing he had walked in a massive, exhausting circle was almost more devastating than the physical fatigue. His brain simply refused to process it. He was a master navigator, he had used the sun perfectly, yet somehow, the dense, suffocating topography of the Blackwood Valley, combined with the invisible influence of whoever was hunting him, had completely shattered his sense of direction. He was not just lost, he was actively being contained. He forced himself to look away from the carving, taking deep, shuddering breaths to stop a full-blown panic attack. He checked his watch. It was nearing 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The thick canopy overhead was already starting to aggressively filter out the remaining sunlight, casting long, sickly gray shadows across the forest floor. A heavy, damp fog was beginning to roll in from the east, clinging low to the ground and significantly reducing his visibility. If he did not find a way out, or at least a highly defensible position before total darkness fell, he knew he would not survive the night. He decided to completely abandon the sun navigation method. Instead, he chose to rely entirely on his knowledge of water flow. Even in a warped landscape, gravity always pulled water downhill. If he could find a stream, no matter how small, it would eventually lead to a river, and a river would eventually lead to a road or a bridge. He turned his back to the marked tree, picked the steepest downward slope he could see through the thickening fog, and began to carefully pick his way down into a deep, rocky ravine. The descent was brutal. The ground was incredibly loose, covered in slick, rotting leaves and loose shale. Twice, he lost his footing and slid several feet on his back, badly scraping his hands and tearing the knees of his sturdy hiking pants. As he reached the bottom of the narrow V-shaped ravine, the air grew incredibly cold and dense. He did not find a stream, but the ground was undeniably soft and muddy, indicating water occasionally flowed through here. He decided to follow the lowest point of the ravine, hoping it would lead him out. He walked carefully along the muddy bottom for about 20 minutes, his eyes constantly scanning the steep, treacherous walls on either side of him. The fog was so thick down here that he could barely see 30 feet ahead. Suddenly, his left boot caught on something incredibly hard and perfectly straight hidden beneath the mud. He stumbled forward, barely catching himself, before face-planting into the dirt. He turned around and crouched down, using his hunting knife to scrape away the thick layers of wet leaves and mud to see what he had tripped over. It was a perfectly smooth, solid steel pipe, about 2 inches in diameter, running directly across the bottom of the ravine. Arthur stared at it in complete disbelief. A steel pipe belonged in a city or a residential neighborhood. It absolutely did not belong, buried under the mud in an uncharted ravine deep inside the Blackwood Valley. His heart started pounding frantically again. He carefully followed the exposed pipe with his eyes, tracing its path up the steep, muddy embankment to his right. About 15 feet up the slope, the pipe simply vanished into what looked like a massive, tangled pile of dead brush, fallen branches, and thick vines. But as Arthur looked closer, squinting through the creeping fog, his expert eyes noticed something deeply disturbing. The pile of brush was far too dense, far too perfectly arranged. It was not a natural accumulation of debris. It was a meticulously constructed, highly deliberate camouflage blind. Against every single rational survival instinct, screaming in his head to run away, a sickening, overpowering wave of curiosity forced Arthur to slowly climb up the slippery embankment. As he got within 5 feet of the camouflage structure, the metallic, rusted penny smell from the day before hit him so hard he almost gagged. It was pouring out from whatever was hidden behind those dead branches. He reached out with his left hand, knife gripped tightly in his right, and slowly pulled back a thick section of dead vines. Behind the camouflage was a heavy, rusted metal door set deeply into a reinforced concrete frame that had been built directly into the side of the ravine. There was no handle on the outside, only a heavy steel deadbolt that was currently completely unlatched. Arthur's breathing became incredibly shallow. He knew he should turn around and run, but he also knew that whoever owned this bunker was the same person who had stolen his rope, marked the trees, and trapped him in a circle. If he wanted to understand what he was up against, the answer was inside. He pressed his shoulder against the cold, rusted metal and pushed. The heavy door groaned loudly, the rusted hinges screaming in the dead silence of the woods, and swung inward into absolute pitch-black darkness. He quickly pulled a small, high-powered tactical flashlight from his pocket, clicked it on, and stepped inside. The air in the bunker was freezing cold and smelled strongly of bleach, damp earth, and that horrible underlying metallic scent. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a space that was roughly 15 feet wide and 20 feet deep. It was not an abandoned, forgotten relic. It was fully, actively lived in. There was a filthy, stained mattress shoved into one corner, surrounded by dozens of empty, rusted food cans. A small makeshift desk sat against the far wall, covered in strange scattered tools and what looked like detailed, hand-drawn maps. But it was not the trash or the maps that made Arthur's blood turn to absolute ice. It was the walls. Every single inch of the concrete walls was completely covered in photographs. There were hundreds of them, hastily taped or pinned to the stone. Arthur slowly shined his flashlight across the disturbing collage. They were all candid, voyeuristic photos of people in the woods. There were pictures of families having picnics, couples walking on distant trails, and solo hikers setting up their tents. None of the people in the photos were looking at the camera. They had no idea they were being watched. Arthur's hand began to shake violently. He moved the beam of light to the wall directly above the filthy mattress. Pinned exactly at eye level, right where whoever slept there would see it first thing in the morning, was a cluster of very recent photographs. The edges of the photo paper were still clean. Arthur stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The first photo was a crystal clear shot of his own pickup truck, parked at the end of the logging road. The second photo was taken from behind a tree, showing Arthur walking confidently into the brush on his very first day. And the final photo, taped directly in the center, was taken in complete darkness, illuminated only by a faint, grainy night vision lens. It showed Arthur lying perfectly still inside his zipped-up tent, his eyes wide open, staring blindly up at the ceiling. The picture had been taken from mere inches away, right through the thin nylon fabric, exactly at 2 o'clock in the morning. Whoever lived in this bunker had not just watched him. They had documented his terror. The human brain is a highly complex machine, but when it is confronted with an absolutely undeniable, lethal threat, it strips away all of that complexity in a fraction of a second. It completely bypasses logic, it bypasses reasoning, and it slams down hard on the bright red panic button labeled fight or flight. The moment Arthur stared at that grainy green tinted photograph of his own terrified face inside his tent, his brain screamed at him to run. He did not take another second to search the bunker. He did not care about the maps or the tools or the rusted cans. He spun around so fast that he practically threw his own shoulder out of its socket, bolted through the heavy, rusted metal doorway, and plunged right back out into the freezing dense fog of the ravine. By the time he scrambled wildly back up the steep, muddy embankment, ripping the skin off of his knuckles as he blindly grabbed at exposed tree roots, the last dying traces of daylight had completely evaporated. The Blackwood Valley was now plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The thick fog clinging to the forest floor made the beam of his tactical flashlight practically useless, bouncing the harsh white light right back into his eyes and creating an impenetrable wall of glowing gray mist. Arthur did not care about the lack of visibility. He did not care about the noise he was making. He just ran. He ran with a raw, desperate kind of speed that he did not even know his 50-year-old body was still capable of producing. He crashed brutally through thick, thorny bushes, completely ignoring the sharp branches tearing through his clothes and ripping deep gashes into his arms and face. He bounced off of massive tree trunks, stumbled over hidden rocks, and kept pushing forward, his heavy breathing sounding like a freight train in the dead quiet woods. But he was not the only one making noise anymore. The previous night, the intruder outside of his tent had been incredibly careful, taking slow, meticulously calculated steps to avoid making a sound. But now, the game of hide-and-seek was officially over. As Arthur sprinted blindly through the trees, he could hear the heavy, thundering sound of footsteps aggressively crashing through the brush directly behind him. The stalker was no longer trying to be stealthy. They were actively, furiously giving chase. Arthur could hear the incredibly loud, violent snapping of large branches being broken out of the way, and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of feet hitting the ground at a terrifyingly fast pace. Whatever was back there was big, it was incredibly fast, and it was closing the distance between them with horrifying ease. Arthur forced his burning legs to pump harder, desperately trying to weave in and out of the massive pine trees to break the stalker's line of sight. He glanced frantically over his shoulder, but he could not see anything through the thick, swirling fog. The heavy footsteps behind him were getting louder and louder. They were maybe 50 yards back, then 40, then 30. The sheer physical power required to run through a dense, unmapped forest in pitch-black darkness at that speed was inhuman. And then, right as Arthur felt his lungs begin to physically burn from the extreme exertion, the heavy, crashing footsteps behind him suddenly stopped. Arthur kept running for another 50 feet before he blindly threw himself behind the massive, thick trunk of an old giant oak tree. He collapsed against the rough bark, clutching his chest, desperately trying to quiet his violent, gasping breaths. The absolute silence of the forest slammed back down on him like a physical weight. He strained his ears, listening for the sound of snapping twigs or heavy breathing, but there was nothing. For a brief, fleeting second, Arthur wildly hoped that he had somehow managed to lose his pursuer in the dark and the fog. But then a sound sliced through the dead, freezing air that made Arthur's blood turn to absolute ice. It was a whistle. It was not a loud, sharp whistle used to call a dog or signal for help. It was a soft, casual, airy whistle, the exact kind of sound a person makes when they are happily strolling down a sunny street without a single care in the world. The notes floated eerily through the trees, completely undistorted by the fog. Arthur pressed his hands tightly over his mouth to stifle a sob of pure terror. He recognized the melody instantly, that very morning, while he had been boiling water for his freeze-dried coffee over his small camping stove, desperately trying to calm his nerves after a terrifying night. He had been softly, mindlessly humming a very specific old country song to himself. He had not even realized he was doing it at the time. The whistling coming from the darkness was perfectly repeating that exact same country melody. The stalker was not just hunting him, they were mocking him. They were letting Arthur know, without speaking a single word, that they had been right there, watching him, listening to him, entirely undetected in the broad daylight. The whistling paused for a few seconds, and then started up again. But this time, it was unmistakably closer. The stalker was slowly, casually walking right toward the tree where Arthur was hiding. Arthur stood frozen behind the massive oak tree, his back pressed painfully hard against the rough bark. The casual, airy whistling was getting louder, closer, drifting through the dense fog like a ghost. It was the most unnatural, horrifying sound he had ever heard. He raised his tactical flashlight with a violently shaking hand, his thumb resting heavily on the rubber button. His plan was desperate but simple. He was going to wait until the stalker stepped into the clearing, hit them straight in the eyes with the blinding strobe function, and use those 3 seconds of disorientation to violently attack with his hunting knife. But the deep woods are rarely that forgiving. As Arthur braced himself for the physical confrontation, the bright, piercing white beam of his flashlight suddenly dimmed. It flickered rapidly 3 times, emitted a faint, high-pitched whining sound, and then completely died. The lithium battery, heavily drained by the freezing cold temperatures and the intense, continuous use over the past 2 days, had completely failed. The absolute suffocating blackness of the Blackwood Valley instantly swallowed him whole. Arthur was completely helplessly blind. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded his veins. He immediately dropped to his hands and knees, frantically feeling around the base of the massive trees in the pitch-black fog. His bare hands brushed against wet dirt, sharp rocks, and thick, slimy moss. He needed cover right now. Then his left hand slipped past a thick root and plunged into a large, empty void. He frantically felt around the jagged edges of the wood and realized he had found the hollowed-out base of a massive, ancient cedar tree. The opening was incredibly narrow, barely wide enough for a grown man's shoulders, but pure desperation is an incredibly powerful motivator. Arthur quickly unbuckled his heavy backpack and shoved it blindly into the bushes, not caring if he ever saw it again. He dropped to his stomach and violently twisted his body, forcing himself backward, shoulder first, into the tight, rotten hole. The inside of the dead tree was an absolute nightmare of claustrophobia. It smelled overwhelmingly of wet decay, heavily compacted damp earth, and crawling insects. The jagged splinters of rotting wood dug sharply into his back, his shoulders, and the back of his head, but he did not dare move a single muscle to make himself comfortable. He pulled his knees up tightly against his chest, gripping the leather handle of his hunting knife so hard that his hand physically began to cramp, and squeezed his eyes tightly shut. He focused entirely on trying to control his own breathing, desperately trying to silence his own terrified body. But in the incredibly confined, tight space of the hollow trunk, his own bodily functions sounded impossibly, dangerously loud. The adrenaline rushing through his ears sounded exactly like a roaring river. His heart was hammering against his ribs so violently, so incredibly hard, that he genuinely feared the stalker would be able to hear the physical thumping vibrating through the dead wood of the tree. A freezing cold sweat poured down his forehead, stinging his eyes and mixing with the dirt on his face, but he absolutely refused to blink or wipe it away. Outside the tree, the mocking, airy whistling suddenly stopped. The suffocating, dead silence of the isolated forest returned, but only for a few agonizing, stretched out seconds. Then the incredibly slow, heavy bipedal footsteps started up again. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. The stalker was no longer running aggressively. They were pacing. They were slowly, methodically walking through the thick fog, carefully searching the exact area where Arthur's running footsteps had suddenly disappeared. The heavy footsteps drew closer and closer and closer to the hollow cedar. Arthur slowly took a deep breath through his nose and held it. He held the air in his lungs until his chest felt like it was going to literally burst into flames. The heavy footsteps took one final crushing step forward, snapping a dry twig right outside the tree. And then the footsteps stopped completely. Whatever was hunting him was standing directly outside the narrow opening of the hollow tree. Arthur was completely engulfed in pitch-black darkness, but he could physically feel the massive, heavy presence standing mere inches away from his face. It was as if a heavy, dark cloud had settled directly over the opening. The air inside the tree trunk suddenly grew incredibly hot and foul. That exact same sickening, metallic smell of rusted pennies mixed heavily with the undeniable stench of unwashed skin and rotting meat washed over Arthur in a thick, suffocating wave. Then he heard it. It was not a voice. It was not a word. It was the sound of breathing. It was incredibly slow, horribly wet, and deeply labored. It sounded exactly like air being forcefully pushed through a windpipe that was entirely clogged with thick mud and fluid. The horrible rattling wheeze echoed softly in the freezing pitch-black air positioned directly at the entrance of Arthur's hiding spot. The stalker was leaning down, their unseen face positioned directly in front of the narrow opening of the hollow tree, casually listening into the dark. If Arthur exhaled, if he shifted his weight even a tiny fraction of an inch, or if his stomach so much as quietly rumbled, the monster breathing directly into his face would know exactly where he was. Arthur held his breath for so long that black fuzzy spots began to violently dance across his vision. The wet, horrible wheezing sound of the stalker breathing right into the opening of the tree felt completely inescapable. Every single survival instinct Arthur possessed was screaming at him that his lungs were about to fail, that he was going to pass out, and that he had to take a gasp of air. But he knew that if he made even the slightest sound, he would be instantly pulled from that tree and slaughtered in the pitch-black dirt. He bit down so hard on his own lower lip that he tasted warm copper, using the sharp physical pain to distract his brain from the overwhelming desire to breathe. For what felt like 10 full minutes but was likely only 30 seconds, nothing happened. The heavy presence just hovered there in the dark, casually listening. Then Arthur heard the distinct, sickening sound of thick leather scraping against wood. The stalker was shifting its weight, Arthur thought, for one fleeting second of incredible relief that the monster was finally giving up and walking away. But then, without absolutely any verbal warning, the pitch-black silence was violently shattered. The stalker blindly and aggressively rammed a massive, thick tree branch, which had been roughly whittled down to a jagged, deadly point, directly into the narrow opening of the hollow cedar. The heavy, sharpened wood violently smashed into the decaying interior of the tree directly beside Arthur's head, raining sharp splinters all over his face. Before Arthur could even react, the stalker brutally yanked the branch back out and violently slammed it inside again. This time, the crude wooden spear plunged deep into the hollow space and violently scraped across Arthur's left side, tearing cleanly through his thick flannel jacket and slicing a burning shallow gash across his ribcage. The stalker did not know exactly where Arthur was inside the pitch black hole, but it knew he was in there somewhere, and it was violently churning the inside of the hollow tree like a blender to force him out. Arthur realized instantly that if he stayed curled up in that tight wooden coffin for even 3 more seconds, the next blind thrust would easily go straight through his neck or his chest. He had absolutely no choice left, letting out a raw, guttural, deafening scream of pure, unfiltered adrenaline. Arthur violently exploded out of the hollow tree. He lunged entirely blind into the freezing black fog, driving his razor-sharp hunting knife forward with every single ounce of strength he had left in his body. His shoulder brutally collided with what felt like a solid wall of heavy muscle and thick bone. The sheer physical impact knocked all the air completely out of his lungs. He felt his knife plunge into something incredibly thick and heavy, but it did not feel like flesh. It felt like he had stabbed directly into a tightly woven layer of extremely thick, stiff animal hides. Before Arthur could pull his knife back for a second strike, a massive, incredibly heavy hand shot out of the darkness and violently clamped down over his right wrist. The fingers felt like thick iron bands. The stalker twisted Arthur's arm with such extreme, horrifying force that a loud pop echoed in the cold air, and Arthur's hand immediately went completely numb. The hunting knife slipped helplessly from his paralyzed fingers and disappeared into the wet mud. In the very next second, a blunt, devastating blow crashed into the center of Arthur's chest. He was literally lifted off of his feet and thrown violently backward through the air, crashing hard into the tangled, thorny underbrush. He frantically scrambled backward in the deep mud, blindly kicking his boots out to keep the massive, heavy shadow away from him. He could hear the stalker stepping heavily toward him, that horrible wheezing breath now turning into a low, wet, angry growl. Arthur was completely disarmed, practically blind, and his right arm was dangling uselessly at his side. He was going to die right here in the mud, but then his left hand violently brushed against his heavy tactical belt, and his fingers wrapped around a small, hard plastic handle. It was his emergency flare gun. He always carried it clipped to his waist for search and rescue operations, but he had completely forgotten it was there in the blind panic of the chase. The heavy plastic gun contained exactly one single, highly pressurized magnesium flare. The heavy footsteps of the stalker closed the distance, the terrible metallic smell completely suffocating Arthur as the massive figure loomed directly over his lying body. Arthur did not even bother trying to aim. He ripped the flare gun from his belt, pointed the thick orange barrel directly upward, angled slightly toward the towering shadow, and violently pulled the heavy trigger. A deafening, explosive crack violently shattered the dead silence of the Blackwood Valley. The intense recoil snapped Arthur's wrist back. Instantly, a massive, hissing ball of chemical fire erupted from the barrel. The pitch-black darkness of the deep woods was instantly, violently annihilated. The entire forest was suddenly bathed in an incredibly harsh, blinding, blood-red light. The glowing magnesium flare shot straight up, violently crashing into the thick, low-hanging pine branches directly above them, exploding into a terrifying shower of burning red sparks that rained down over the mud. For one single, horrifying fraction of a second, the blinding crimson light perfectly illuminated the thing standing over Arthur. It was a person, but the figure was massive, easily standing over 6.5 feet tall, completely draped in heavy, filthy layers of rotting animal skins and thick mud. But it was the face that burned itself permanently into Arthur's brain. The stalker was wearing a crude, terrifyingly tight mask, completely stitched together from dried, cured leathers, with only two small, uneven, jagged holes cut out for the eyes. The sudden, intense heat of the burning magnesium sparks raining down on them, combined with the violently bright, explosive red light, caught the stalker completely off guard. The massive figure let out a horrible, ear-piercing shriek that sounded entirely inhuman, violently threw its heavy arms over its masked face to shield its deeply sensitive eyes, and staggered heavily backward away from the hissing red light. Arthur knew with absolute certainty that this was the only window of opportunity he would ever get. Arthur did not wait to see if the blinding red light of the chemical flare would hold the massive stalker back for more than a few agonizing seconds. The exact moment the hulking masked figure violently threw its heavy arms over its face and staggered backward into the pitch-black shadows, Arthur violently shoved himself off the muddy ground using his good left arm. His right arm was still hanging entirely limp and useless at his side, sending sickening waves of deep, throbbing pain directly into his shoulder socket with every single movement he made. But the raw, explosive surge of pure adrenaline pumping furiously through his veins completely masked the worst of the physical agony. He immediately turned his back on the hissing, violently burning red light and launched himself blindly into the thick, dark trees. For the first 30 or 40 seconds of his desperate sprint, the glowing red sparks raining heavily down from the canopy above provided just enough unnatural, bloody illumination for him to weave frantically between the massive tree trunks without completely crushing his skull against the thick wood. But emergency magnesium flares burn out incredibly fast. Within less than a minute, the intense hissing crackle faded into a weak, pathetic sputter. The terrifying crimson light shrank rapidly, flickered twice, and then died completely, plunging the Blackwood Valley right back into an absolute suffocating abyss of pitch-black darkness and thick, freezing fog. Arthur was completely blind once again, but he absolutely did not stop running. He could not stop. He practically threw his body down a steep, rocky incline, his heavy leather boots sliding uncontrollably over wet, rotting leaves and loose, jagged shale. He crashed brutally through a massive, tangled thicket of dead briar bushes. The incredibly sharp, woody thorns violently snagged his thick flannel jacket, tearing it to absolute shreds and slicing deep, burning gashes into his cheeks, his neck, and his bare hands. He could physically feel his own warm blood rapidly dripping down the side of his face and stinging his eyes, but he kept his head down and forcefully plowed through the jagged barrier like a deeply terrified animal. He ran relentlessly for what felt like 2 straight hours, though in reality it was probably closer to 20 agonizing minutes. Every single breath he took felt like he was inhaling broken glass. His chest heaved violently, and his legs were trembling so badly that they threatened to simply give out entirely from underneath him. He finally tripped heavily over a massive, completely unseen tree root, crashing painfully hard onto his left shoulder in the soft mud. He lay there in the freezing dirt, completely paralyzed by utter physical exhaustion, gasping desperately for air. He strained his ringing ears, terrified of what he might hear echoing out of the impenetrable darkness behind him. For a few incredibly tense moments, there was absolutely nothing but the sound of his own wheezing lungs. But then, drifting slowly through the heavy, freezing fog, he heard it again. Snap, crunch, splash, the heavy bipedal footsteps were back. They were completely relentless. The stalker had fully recovered from the blinding light of the flare and was expertly tracking Arthur's clumsy, incredibly noisy path through the broken brush. But the footsteps sounded slightly different now. They were not methodical or pacing anymore. They sounded deeply furious, tearing aggressively through the dense forest at an incredibly terrifying speed. Arthur forced his broken, battered body to stand back up. He knew he could not physically outrun the stalker in a straight foot race, not in his current condition. But as he stood perfectly still, swaying slightly on his feet, his desperately straining ears picked up a second sound buried faintly beneath the heavy, crashing footsteps. It was a low, constant, rushing rumble. It was water, a lot of water. Arthur instantly remembered his strict survival training. In a heavily warped, unmapped valley, a massive body of water was his only guaranteed exit ticket. He completely abandoned any remaining attempt at stealth and threw himself directly toward the low, rushing sound. The ground began to slope violently downward again, becoming incredibly slick and heavy with deep mud. He slipped and slid down the steep embankment, completely out of control, until he suddenly crashed waist deep into freezing, violently rushing water. He had finally found the Blackwood River. It was a massive, incredibly fast-moving waterway that cut directly through the deepest part of the wild valley. The water was violently cold, practically turning the blood in his legs to solid ice on impact. But the river was incredibly wide, and the heavy, thick mud on the riverbanks would make it virtually impossible for the stalker to sneak up on him without making a tremendous amount of noise. Arthur dragged his heavy, soaking wet body out of the deep current and collapsed onto the muddy, rocky bank. He looked back up the steep, pitch black embankment he had just tumbled down. He could hear the stalker tearing aggressively through the brush, maybe 50 yards away. But as the heavy footsteps reached the very top of the steep, muddy ridge overlooking the river, they suddenly stopped. Arthur held his breath, lying perfectly flat against the freezing wet rocks. He stared up into the impenetrable darkness, waiting for the massive, leather-masked figure to come sliding down the mud to finish him off. But the stalker did not follow. The river was a massive natural boundary, leaving the dense, confusing cover of the deep trees to expose itself on the completely open riverbank was a tactical disadvantage the stalker was apparently entirely unwilling to take. The terrifying, wet wheezing sound echoed faintly one last time from the top of the ridge, and then slowly the heavy, crushing footsteps began to back away, eventually fading completely into the suffocating silence of the deep woods. Arthur did not move from the freezing riverbank for the rest of the night. He lay there shivering violently, completely soaked to the bone, bleeding from dozens of deep cuts with a severely dislocated right wrist. He waited in agonizing, mind-numbing terror, watching the pitch-black sky directly above the rushing water, praying that the monster would not change its twisted mind and come back down the ridge. Finally, after what felt like an entire lifetime of pure, unadulterated nightmare, the pitch-black sky slowly began to turn a bruised, deeply pale shade of dark purple. Then the purple slowly faded into a cold, misty gray. The sun was finally rising. The heavy, suffocating fog began to slowly lift off the surface of the violently rushing water. Arthur dragged himself to his feet. He could barely walk. He leaned heavily to his left side, clutching his completely useless right arm tightly against his chest. He turned his back to the terrifying ancient trees of the Blackwood Valley and began to slowly, painfully follow the heavy flow of the river directly downstream. He hobbled along the rocky bank for roughly 3 agonizing miles, his mind completely blank, operating entirely on the absolute last remaining drops of his physical and mental endurance. Just as the bright morning sun fully broke over the top of the distant tree line, casting blinding yellow light directly across the water, Arthur saw a beautiful, impossible sight. It was a massive, heavily reinforced concrete bridge spanning directly over the river. And sitting quietly just beyond the bridge, surrounded by a tall chain-link fence, was a small, white-painted county ranger station. Arthur had finally miraculously made it back to the edge of the civilized world. Arthur collapsed through the front glass doors of the county ranger station, completely covered head to toe in drying mud, deep, bloody scratches, and freezing water. The two on-duty rangers immediately jumped from their desks, calling frantically for emergency medical services and heavily armed local law enforcement. Within exactly 2 hours, Arthur was lying safely in a sterile, brightly lit hospital bed, receiving warm intravenous fluids and heavy painkillers for his severely dislocated right wrist. Once his physical condition was completely stabilized, he sat down in his hospital room with 4 different county sheriffs and told them exactly what he had experienced over the last 48 hours. He drew them a highly detailed, hand-drawn map of his frantic route. He described the perfectly stacked riverstones. He described the freshly carved triangles dripping with wet sap. And most importantly, he described the heavily camouflaged underground bunker hidden deep in the foggy ravine with the terrifying wall of stolen photographs. Because Arthur was a highly respected 15-year veteran of the Forest Service, the local police took his claims incredibly seriously. Early the very next morning, a heavily armed search and rescue team, accompanied by highly trained tracking dogs, launched a massive coordinated sweep of the Blackwood Valley region. They used Arthur's exact coordinates and his incredibly detailed description of the landscape to pinpoint the specific ravine. 3 days later, the search team returned. The lead sheriff walked slowly into Arthur's hospital room with a deeply grim, highly confused expression on his face. The heavily armed search team had successfully found the exact hollow cedar tree where Arthur had hidden. They found his discarded heavy-duty backpack shoved deeply into the thorny bushes, completely untouched. They even found the burned-out plastic shell of the emergency magnesium flare half buried in the mud by the rushing river. But that was absolutely it. They scoured the entire surrounding area for the steep, muddy ravine Arthur had explicitly described. When they finally found the exact spot, the massive pile of dead brush was completely gone. The heavy rusted metal door was completely gone. In its place was nothing but a solid, completely undisturbed wall of natural dirt and ancient tree roots. There was absolutely no underground bunker. There were no rusted food cans scattered in the corners. There was no terrifying wall of voyeuristic photographs. Furthermore, the highly trained tracking dogs could not pick up a single trace of an unfamiliar human scent anywhere near the surrounding area. It was exactly as if the massive, terrifying man in the stitched leather mask had simply evaporated into thin air, taking his entire horrifying underground lair with him. The local police eventually closed the case, officially chalking the more extreme details up to a severe hallucination caused by extreme dehydration, physical exhaustion, and deep isolation paranoia. Arthur knew they did not believe him, but he was simply too physically and mentally drained to fight them on it. After spending a full week recovering in the hospital, he was finally discharged. He returned to his quiet suburban home, securely locked every single door and window, and tried his absolute best to put the terrifying nightmare entirely behind him. Exactly 3 weeks later, Arthur was finally feeling brave enough to unpack his recovered hiking backpack, which had been sitting completely untouched in the dark corner of his living room since the police had politely returned it to him. He slowly pulled out his folded nylon tent, his portable camping stove, and his spare, muddy clothing. Buried at the very bottom of the heavy bag was his small, highly durable digital camera. He had brought it along specifically to take beautiful pictures of the autumn leaves, but he had completely forgotten about it after the terrifying events began to unfold. He turned the small camera on, fully expecting to see the few peaceful landscape pictures he had taken on the very first day of his hike. The bright digital screen flashed to life, but as he looked at the internal photo gallery, his heart suddenly stopped completely cold in his chest. The camera explicitly stated there were absolutely no new photographs. But there was one single newly recorded video file. Arthur's hands began to shake violently. He slowly, hesitantly pushed the play button on the back of the camera. The small digital screen instantly went pitch black, illuminated only by the faint, grainy green tint of the camera's built-in night vision mode. The video file lasted for exactly 45 seconds. The terrifying footage began with the camera, lens pointed directly downward at the dark nylon floor of a tent. Arthur could hear the familiar, suffocating, dead silence of the deep woods heavily in the background. Then the camera slowly, incredibly smoothly, panned upward. The green-tinted lens focused perfectly on Arthur's own face. He was lying completely flat on his back, deeply asleep inside his thermal sleeping bag. The video had not been taken from outside the tent through the thin nylon fabric. The camera was entirely inside the tent. Arthur stared in absolute pure horror as the terrifying realization fully washed over him. As the video continued to play, he heard a deeply unsettling sound coming from directly behind the camera lens. It was the exact same slow, wet, horribly congested, wheezing sound he had heard standing right outside the hollow tree. The stalker had not just quietly circled his camp on that very first night. They had silently unzipped the tent flap while Arthur was dead asleep, quietly crawled completely inside with him, and physically found his camera in the pitch black dark. In the final 10 agonizing seconds of the video, a massive, incredibly heavy hand covered in thick mud and black dirt slowly reached out from behind the camera lens. The hand hovered intentionally, terrifyingly still, just inches above Arthur's sleeping face. Then, one single, heavily calloused finger slowly reached down and gently, almost affectionately, stroked the hair entirely off of Arthur's sweating forehead. Arthur in the video did not wake up or even flinch. The thick, filthy hand slowly retreated back into the dark. The wet wheezing grew slightly heavier, slightly closer to the microphone, and then the video abruptly ended, cutting to a completely black screen. Arthur dropped the small camera directly onto the hardwood floor, his mind completely and utterly shattering. The monster had not just been aggressively hunting him through the deep woods. It had been mere inches away from his face, holding his entire life completely in its filthy, massive hands, and actively decided to let him live just to play a deeply twisted, horrifying game. So I have a very serious question for you. If you were lying deeply asleep in the absolute middle of nowhere, hundreds of miles away from any help, and you suddenly realized that a deeply twisted, masked predator was sitting completely silently in the pitch black darkness right beside your head, simply watching you breathe, what would you do? Would you keep your eyes tightly shut, pretend to stay asleep, and deeply pray that they eventually leave? Or would you open your eyes and violently face whatever was waiting for you in the dark? Please let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching or reading today's story. If you genuinely enjoyed this level of terrifying true wilderness mystery, please remember to aggressively high-five the subscribe button on your way out. Have a great night, and remember, always stay out of the deep woods.